I've been a Spanish property owner now for the past 4 years, and in this video I'm going to share what I would say to someone who's considering buying a property in Spain at this point in time. Is it better to buy or rent? And we'll look at some numbers as we go through the video, along with some other considerations that perhaps don't necessarily come to mind at first, but you should definitely have them on your mind when you're making the decision. Let's get right into it. So towards the end of 2021, I became a property owner here in Spain. I purchased an apartment out in one of the eastern suburbs of Madrid, which is where I've been living for the past 4 years. And before that, I was living in the center of Madrid, renting an apartment as well. Owning an apartment over the past 4 years has worked out pretty well for me, given a lot of the economic and environmental factors that we've seen over the past 4 years, such as how interest rates have increased, inflation, and the impact that's had on the housing market and rents. The timing of my purchase was right before that, so I was very fortunate. I was able to lock in a fixed rate mortgage at a very attractive interest rate, and I'm now paying a very good fixed amount per month for my mortgage here. And so whilst the housing market is very different today from what it was 4 years ago, a lot of the same considerations and things that I took into account, as well as things that I didn't take into account but perhaps should have when I bought, still apply. And that's essentially what I'm going to walk you through right now. And the first thing we're going to talk about is kind of the long-term prospects and perspective that you should have when buying a property. This is something that I certainly did when I bought the apartment. I asked myself questions like, am I going to be able to afford this over the long term, even in the worst case scenarios? What is my exit scenario here if ever I leave Spain, move to a different city, want to buy a different property, etc. All these kind of things were on my mind. Something else that I was aware of, but perhaps didn't give it the importance that I could have done or should have done, is the age of the property and the state that the property was in. Now, if you're buying a new or relatively new property, this is less of a concern for you. But in Spain, there are a lot of older apartments that were built in the 60s, 70s, like this one, for example, even before that as well, or even slightly after it. This is not necessarily problematic per se, but they can come with pain points that newer apartments wouldn't necessarily have. For example, older apartments, when it comes to things like energy efficiency, insulation, material quality, is obviously very different from the type of apartments that are being built today. And especially when the European Union is bringing out regulations such as that by 2030, if you want to rent or sell a property in the European Union, Spain in this case, there is a minimum energy efficiency rating of D required for you to be able to do that. And there are many properties across Spain right now that do not meet this criteria. Other things that can come with older apartments and buildings as well is the fact that they might not have an elevator or a lift readily available. That might need to be built at some time in the future. As I talked about in a recent video on being a property owner within the Comunidad, it can be the case that you can sometimes end up with a situation where, because of the age of one of the owners or perhaps through a disability, it becomes compulsory to put an elevator or a lift into the building. These things obviously will increase your comunidad, that's your monthly kind of community contribution costs, but it will also result in a very big initial financial outlay, which can be very problematic for you as a property owner if you're not financially prepared for it. And so in addition to having this long-term perspective of, buying, maybe selling, whatever you're going to do with your property down the line, think about the state that it's in at the moment you buy it and how it may cause challenges or require some financial outlay to get it up to standards if you want to rent it out at some point and perhaps the energy efficiency isn't up to scratch, for example, or if at some point down the line there's going to need to be a lift or an elevator, or there's a possibility, because of course in the moment you can't really know that unless you're able to get some insight as to what's been discussed in the meetings of the comunidad of property owners. Also think about the neighborhood and the property market in general when you purchase that property. Neighborhoods can change over time for better or for worse. That's something worth keeping in mind as well. And you need to think about how long you're going to have this property, what the prospects, what the potential development or evolution of the neighborhood is. And that is obviously going to affect the final value of your property, assuming that you come to a point down the line where you're going to sell it on or move away from it. Of course, it's almost impossible and very difficult to predict where the property market is going to go. You could sell your property at a profit if it appreciates in value. There's also the possibility that you sell it at a loss if it depreciates in value. But I think the longer that you own a property for, then the more spread out the cost of ownership is, which we'll come to in just a second. And it makes it more cost effective over the long term. And it may be that overall, even if you're selling at a loss and your property hasn't appreciated in value, or it hasn't appreciated as much as you would have liked in value, if you've held the property for a long time, the numbers worked out quite well for you, then ultimately there's a good chance that you probably saved money versus renting. And that's what we're going to talk about now, the cost of ownership versus the cost of renting, which is a hot debate at any point in the world, but it is something, of course, that you should keep in mind. And I'm going to give you something very specific to Spain here. So in a video I did last year, I looked at the results of a study from Tecnocasa and the Universitat de Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona. And in that study, they found in the majority of cases, financially speaking, it is generally better to buy than to rent in Spain. But in saying that, you need to be aware of what the costs are involved of ownership. And I'm not just talking about what it costs you to buy the property. I'm talking about also the costs that you'll have whilst you're owning the property, and also some costs and taxes that you'll incur when you sell that property as well. So for example, when you buy a property in Spain, the closing costs on that purchase costs, they're going to fall between 10 to 14% typically of the property's value, depending on which autonomous community you're sitting in. That's going to be primarily composed of the ITP or IVA. These are basically purchase taxes, sales tax in the case of a new property, or essentially a second-hand transmission tax if it's a property that's being owned by somebody already. You also have to factor in things like the notary, registry costs, maybe agent fees from some agents as well. These are all things that you have to factor in when you're purchasing the property. When you own the property in Spain, if you're in a building with common areas, or perhaps you're in a private, a gated community, for example, then you may have regular comunidad, which is a monthly payment for upkeep, maintenance of the communal areas, essentially. Depending on where you live, the type of services and common areas you have, this could be anywhere between 40, 50 to over 100 euros per month. So this is worth keeping in mind as well. You'll also have the annual property tax, known as the EB, which is normally in the hundreds of euros as well. As we talked about in the first point, if you need to make any upgrades, do maintenance or renovate the property, that's going to come into your cost of ownership as well. And if you sell the property, if you're selling through an agent, you'll have the agent's commission. You'll also have two essentially capital gains kind of taxes as well that you need to keep in mind. And so with all of that in mind, we're going to take a look now at an example that I've made up with some numbers in that compares essentially the cost of owning a property versus the cost of renting. So let's go over to Excel right now. All right, so let's take a look at the example I've got here. So we've got a property here that I'm saying is worth 140,000 euros. That's my purchase price. My associated purchase costs would be about 14,000 euros, so roughly 10%. We're going to say that the monthly mortgage, based on the conditions that I've set, is about 629 euros. And I have a down payment of 14,000 euros. So this is the kind of the starting point initially with my purchase price and the costs that I incurred when I purchased the property as well. Now let's look at some of the ownership costs I had. So I've put in here, let's say it's a slightly older property or it needed some maintenance. I'm going to say 10,000 euros is what I spent on renovations. I've given myself a 500 euro budget for maintenance. So if something breaks, for example, then I can call out someone to fix that. That's my budget. Note that I'm saying renovation costs and maintenance here. So renovation can be like, you know, a new bathroom, a new kitchen, so something completely transformative that adds value to the property, whereas the expected maintenance is more fixing stuff that goes wrong, basically. We're going to say that the monthly comunidad, so the property owners charge every month, is about 50 euros. We're going to say that the annual property tax, let's lower that a little bit, let's say 250 euros. And then here in the current example where I've set it up for 5 years, after 5 years with my current mortgage conditions, with the monthly mortgage payment and the interest rate that I set up, which for this example, I will tell you now, is 4.4%. I would have paid about 26,000 euros in interest over that time. So the principal part of the mortgage payment is going towards equity in the property, which I'm building up. The interest, that's essentially a cost that I won't get back and is going directly to the bank. Now, let's say I get to a point where I want to sell the property. Let's say I sell it for 170,000 euros, so 30,000 above what I purchased it for. We're going to say the agent charges me 5%, so they're going to get an 8,500 euro commission from the sale of that. That means that at that time, I'll have 115,000 euros left on the mortgage. And there's a couple of taxes that I'll need to pay as well. I'll start with the easiest one, which is capital gains tax, and then we'll come to the plusvalia municipal in a second. So the capital gains tax essentially looks at your profit, which is the sale price, minus any purchase costs, as well as the selling costs as well. So I can exclude the agent fee, for example, I could exclude the ITP, and basically I would only pay capital gains on the difference there. So the taxable profit would only be about 8,000 euros in this case. And going on the progressive scale, which is from 19 to 28%, depending on what the profit is, I would only pay about 1,500 euros in capital gains tax. But I do have to pay essentially the plusvalía municipal as well. And it's really difficult to explain this in very simple terms. But essentially, there's two possible calculation methods. One using a coefficient of the cadastral value of the ground, essentially, of the land, multiplied by however long you've had the property for and by the corresponding tax rate. The other is by looking at the real gain that you've had, again multiplied by the tax rate. So you can choose which one you want based on actually which is more beneficial for you. In this case, the real gain is the more beneficial one. Ganancia real, that's called in Spanish. So my total taxes on the gains would be about 4,200 euros. So if we take all of that together, over that 5 years, it cost me essentially 40,000 euros to own the property, including the taxes as well. If I exclude taxes, about 36,000 euros. But now that was a bit long-winded, but let's come over to the right now because I've got a property here that I could rent as well. So I'm going to say that the rent is about, let's bring it down a bit. Let's say it's 600 euros a month. And say there's no agency fee or commission involved in this case. Let's say there's a 2-month deposit. So we'll put 1,200 euros there. We're going to say that inflation on average goes up about, let's say 3% per year. Let's say 2% actually. Let's say 2% for those 5 years. So the cost of renting, if I come and look over here, what I've essentially got, so I've got a table of the costs that I incur whilst owning over that period of 5 years, as well as what I get back when I sell it. And I've also got on the right what I pay in rent over that time as well. So you can see that over the 5 years, in the example that we're looking at here, we can actually see this cheaper by about 2,000 euros to rent rather than purchasing a property in this case. So with these numbers right here, if I'm looking only at a period of 5 years, then it probably just makes more sense for me to rent a property during that time. Let's say though I expand the timeline. Let's make it 10 years. Now things start to change a little bit. So we got the same cost still, exact same scenario. But because, I'm assuming only 10,000 euros of renovation again over that period of time, I'm assuming that, my maintenance, comunidad, property tax all stay consistent. Yes, my mortgage interest has gone up, but compared to how much rent I would pay over that period of time, and especially with inflation taken into account as well, actually works out 10,000 euros cheaper to buy a property than to rent one. And, we can do this over as many scenarios as we want. If we're looking at 15 years, for example, it becomes 30,000. 20 years, it becomes 56,000 euros. So that's why you really need to look at the numbers carefully and consider how long you're going to be in the property. Is it actually just cheaper to rent if you're going to be there for a 5-year period? The longer the time period, of course, the more probable it is that it works out cheaper and better financially to buy, both from, the better possibility of appreciation of the property, which I actually didn't take into account here in these later scenarios where I expanded the time horizon, but also the fact that your cost of ownership gets spread out over a longer period of time. And then with rents rising in line with inflation and you not building equity in the property, like if we look back at this example again, by the time we get to year 20 or so here, we're at 900 euros in rent almost, and that's almost 50% more expensive than we started out with. And again, that's without adjusting average annual inflation because there could be peaks and troughs and whatever over that time. But you get the idea and the principles that I'm explaining. One detail that I forgot to mention whilst recording as well regarding the mortgage interest rate is that, of course, the longer you own the property as well, the more your interest payments will go down because of the way they're calculated on the higher balance. Those first years of owning a property, when you have a mortgage on it, tend to be primarily interest payments. Whereas in the later years, as the balance goes down, the interest decreases and those payments go more towards the principal of the loan. By the way, guys, before I move on to the final point, what you just saw there was my Spanish property purchase tax calculator, which is a digital product that's available for download from my store on YouTube and from my website as well. This is a new feature that I've added in, the buy versus rent comparison. So if you are trying to make that decision of whether to buy or whether to rent, then you can do that comparison side by side to see what will work out more beneficial for you financially, putting in your own numbers and your own real situation as well. Not only that, but in the other sections of the calculator as well, if you're looking at buying a property or looking at multiple properties to buy and would like to compare them or figure out how much money you need up front, how much you'll pay on a month per your mortgage, what is the most beneficial mortgage condition for you, compare mortgage interest rates and how much interest you'll pay or total mortgage you'll pay over the life of having that property, you can do all of that in the calculator as as well. So if that is something that can help you, you can buy it either as a standalone product or as part of the Spain calculator bundle, which also includes an income tax calculator and a cost of living estimate calculator, where you can work out how much tax you might pay based on your situation and also figure out what your expected cost of living might be in different areas of the country. All right, so up to now we've touched on practical and financial considerations when it comes to buying a property in Spain. But the third one, which I think is definitely underrated and is something that you should also give attention to as well, is the psychological or the mental aspect of it. And so an argument that seems to be coming up more and more, and that I hear a lot on the internet right now, is that renting is a lot less stressful than owning because you don't have to take care of the maintenance or anything. You're not dealing with all of the problems as a property owner. But I would challenge that, and I would say that both owning and renting have their own sense of peace and relief, and they both have their own pain points and stressful parts, let's say. As an owner, yes, it's a pain when something breaks in my house and I have to fix it and shell out money for it, and having to attend some of the community meetings and talk about problems and issues that are going on in the building and stuff. Yes, it's a headache as an owner. But on the peace of mind side of things, like I said earlier in the video, I was able to lock in a fixed rate mortgage that I know that for however long I have this property for, that's the price I'm going to pay every month. And that if 30 years pass and I still have this property, that mortgage will be paid off, the house is mine, and I don't have to worry about any of that. That's part of the peace that comes with ownership that I believe that people don't necessarily look at. Renting is the flip side of the coin, essentially. Yes, you don't have the stress of having to deal with problems with the property. You can get up and leave and go wherever you want. You can walk out, find a new apartment, move to a new city, move to a new country even when you want, because of the flexibility that comes with it. But from a long-term perspective, yes, whilst there's nothing technically preventing you from renting a long time, you are of course susceptible to rent increases through inflation, or rent increases because the landlord simply decided that's the way, for example. When you're renting, you will never own the asset, and your income is going to need to stay sufficiently high to be able to keep paying that rent for as long as you are in a rental situation, which you don't have when you're owning a property. And so whilst I believe that property ownership is generally good, and that over the long term, as we've seen in this video, it can be more financially beneficial, you know, it depends on your situation at a particular moment in time. Does it make sense for a digital nomad coming to Spain for a few years to buy a property? No, probably not. A retired couple looking to move to Spain in their 60s and spend their whole retirement here? Yeah, that probably makes sense to buy. But again, probably you want to rent first to get an idea for the neighborhood, to know which kind of area you like, to develop and build a lifestyle, because of course it's going to be very different to what you have back home. These are all different things that I suggest you keep in mind when you're looking at moving to Spain and buying a property. So there you go, guys. I hope you found this video informative and helpful. Leave a comment and let me know if you've had this buying versus rent debate in Spain at any point and what you decided to do in the end. And if you like this video and you want to see more videos about life in Spain, then be sure to check out these two videos here. Till next time, I'll see you on the next one, and let's get this money.